Time to break down the Buckeyes here at Mark Rogers TV, the voice of college football. And to do so, we bring on Steve Hellwagon. You can catch him on 247 Sports Bucknuts. It's the home for Ohio State football there. He is also a senior Big Ten writer for 247. Steve, how you doing tonight?
I'm doing great, Mark. What's going on in the world?
Well, what's going on is Joe Burrow is no longer a Buckeye. Now, from my perception, and of course, I'm not watching the game film. I'm not there in the huddle. I'm not there in the middle of spring practice and the workouts there. It appeared as though the fan base thought this is Dwayne Haskins' job right after the end of the season because of what he showed us against Michigan. But as time wore on, and especially once we got into spring practice and heard the reports coming out and saw Joe Burrow in the spring game in particular, there seemed to be a groundswell of support that this guy needs to be the starting quarterback. So it was surprising to me, based on that information, that he decided, I don't have a shot at this job.
Well, a very complex situation. I think you've encapsulated it. Joe was the backup in 2016 to JT Barrett. He really only got to play in a few games and was never in a situation where the game was on the line. Then he suffered a broken hand in preseason camp last August. That allowed Dwayne Haskins to kind of move right on by him and into the number 2 spot. And when push came to shove, when they needed to put a number 2 quarterback in a game to win the game at Michigan, it was Haskins whose number got called. And I think it's still up in the air whether Burrow was 100% healthy at that point or not. Certainly in the months that have followed, he's healthy now. He played outstanding in the spring game at Ohio Stadium mid-April, threw for over 200 yards, a couple of touchdowns, threw for a higher percentage than Dwayne Haskins did as well. So I think any way you want to measure it, I think that if Haskins had the lead after the season ended in the Michigan game, then you would have to think that Joe Burrow maybe cut into that lead, if not equaled where Haskins was. And Urban Meyer, he would appear before the media and he would, routinely take a deep breath and just say, I don't have an answer for you. I don't have a number 1. He says even with Tate Martell, he couldn't name who his number 3 would be. So that tells you kind of the situation that they found themselves in. I could tell you from our intelligence, just talking to people around Joe and his family, that this was a very difficult decision for him. He was a guy, obviously he's now an Ohio State graduate, loved Ohio State and enjoyed just about all of his time there, probably other than the frustrating part last fall when he couldn't play. But again, this was not an easy decision for him to walk away. I just think when they took all the emotion out of the situation and looked at it in the light of day, they just said there's been no indication that this is Joe's job. And maybe they just didn't want to risk going into preseason camp and him, for lack of a better term, wasting an entire year as Dwayne Haskins' backup, which would have been the worst case scenario, I think, for Joe. So he's going to exercise his right. He's a graduate. We know that LSU and Cincinnati, Oklahoma, maybe a few other places could get involved, Florida perhaps. It'd be interesting to see. I think he has visits scheduled with LSU and Cincinnati here in the next few days. I guess we'll find out then where things are headed.
So if he wants to go to Cincinnati, so be it. But if he wants to go somewhere and play the same caliber of ball, if you're talking Oklahoma, Florida, LSU, they've been in the news, then there's no guarantee that he's going to win that job either. So he's certainly taking the same risk, I would think, to a certain extent, although maybe he's gotten more info than we do in regards to how he would size up against those quarterback situations.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Again, anywhere he's going to visit, he's obviously had some type of conversation with the offensive coordinator, the quarterback's coach, or even the head coach. And again, these things come together very quickly. He just graduated from Ohio State. So prior to that moment, this past Sunday, unless it was some kind of a back channel communication, of course, his dad is an assistant college football coach at Ohio University in Athens, just an hour or two from the OSU campus. and very well connected throughout college football. Obviously, as a veteran assistant coach, formerly at Nebraska, and curiously, Nebraska. A lot of people thought that with Scott Frost going there, that that potentially would be a good spot for him as well. So, I guess we'll just have to wait and see how that all plays out. But again, this is a situation that's coming, probably changing every hour as more and more schools try and get in on him and at least get him on their campus to take a visit.
Yeah, we were just talking some Miami football with our Miami contributor. Of course, they've got a week one showdown with LSU, and there was these LSU fans can't wait to get Joe Burrow on campus. They just think he's going to be the savior, and based on the quarterback play that they've had recently, they might be right. When you look at the quarterback situation now at Ohio State, Urban Meyer's looking at a situation where I guess part one of my question is this a true competition, or does Dwayne Haskins have the job? I know that it's a competition on the surface. That's going to be the rhetoric, but does Haskins have the job? And point number two, Urban Meyer goes from having three quarterbacks that he could basically trust to more likely just two. So Tate Martell and all this talk of he being the wild card, the runner, the guy that comes in with special packages designed for him, maybe they don't want to get him hurt, and it changes the game plan.
Yeah, because I think that there probably was going to be a package of plays where Tate Martell would be involved on the goal line, because I think he could have a tremendous impact in the red zone with his ability to keep plays alive, roll out, run the quarterback draw, anything, maybe even the naked bootleg, whatever you want to call for him. That is something that he is capable of doing in that goal line situation. I think it is Dwayne Haskins' job, clearly, as the number one guy. I think what he did against the University of Michigan is carrying the day right now. He's the only quarterback on scholarship at Ohio State who's ever appeared in a live game. They've got Tate Martell, who redshirted this past year, and they also have Matthew Baldwin coming in from Texas. He actually enrolled in January, but his season was ended in December with a knee injury, a torn ACL, and it's up in the air how soon he will be full go again. The hope is that he'll be ready to go for the start of preseason practice, but we just don't. It's impossible to predict at this point how that injury will respond, and they desperately need him to be the number three guy, because that's all they have right now. It's interesting with all this talk about Burrow leaving as a graduate transfer. Maybe Ohio State will be in the graduate transfer mold as well, to try and get an insurance policy and have somebody who's at least got some experience to back up Dwayne Haskins. Haven't gotten any names about that yet, but I think that would be an interesting scenario to trade one graduate transfer maybe for another. Although Joe having 2 years of eligibility is a little bit different than bringing in a guy for a one-and-done situation, which is what it would be if you bring in a guy with 1 year of eligibility left. Martell, to me, has a tremendous upside. He didn't play particularly well in the spring game. I think his stats were 4 of 13 passing, 20-some yards, and that was not a lot to hang your hat on, but he is very effective as a runner. Probably would have rushed for well over 100 yards in that game had they had tackling rules as opposed to just contact rules for part of the scrimmage. So very exciting player. And Dwayne Haskins, one of the strongest arm quarterbacks, in my opinion, probably in the country, can make some big-time throws as he did against Michigan for the Buckeyes. And I think that Urban Meyer, Ryan Day, the quarterback's coach, Kevin Wilson, the coordinator, they're all excited to get him in there and see what he can do.
Steve, I've got to think that the tricky aspect of the recruitment process for a grad transfer is that for him to be good enough for Urban Meyer to trust him, even as a third string quarterback at Ohio State, he would have to be at the quality that he's looking to go start somewhere else. He wants to be a starting quarterback if he's that good. And then if he's not that good, then Ohio State doesn't want him.
Yeah.
So it's going to be difficult to find somebody of that caliber.
That is a catch-22, because when you look at it, you obviously, if you're going to bring somebody on board, You want to bring somebody who can help your team. And at the same time, guys typically aren't going to leave a starting situation to go and ride the bench somewhere else. So unless they are coming from a Sun Belt school or a MAC school and they want the opportunity to play big-time college football, even if it is as a backup, or be a member of a team that can possibly contend for the playoff. You know, most of the preseason rankings in the magazines, this is such a neat time. It's May 10th. I think within 2 weeks, we'll be looking at, instead of outdated NFL draft and outdated baseball magazines on our newsstands, we're going to have some college football players on the newsstand with all the different magazines that'll be coming out. But Buckeyes right now are pretty much seen third behind Clemson and Alabama, the prohibitive favorite in the Big Ten, a conference that they pretty well dominated last year, with the exception of the Iowa game. And as things stand, Iowa's not on the schedule for Ohio State in the upcoming season. So a lot of people think they are the team to beat, certainly in the Big Ten, and it would be an appetizing place, I think, for any transfer to try and come and play.
It's not quite the same during the internet age, but there was a day when, of course, you couldn't wait to get to the newsstand when the college football magazines would come out in the spring and summer to get you all set with all the personnel breakdowns and all the rankings and all the predictions and schedules for the upcoming season. We got Steve Hellwagon on the line from 247 Sports. You can join him on Bucknuts. He's also the senior Big Ten writer for 247. And recruiting has kicked into gear here, Steve, just in the last month for the Buckeyes, with 6 huge recruits coming to a place of commitment for what is now the number 2 class in the Big Ten, according to 247, number 9 in the nation. Garrett Wilson, a wide receiver out of Austin, Texas, 5th ranked at his position, just making that commitment on April 29th. And there's a host of other guys. Who stands out to you?
Oh, my goodness. Yeah, they really did a bang-up job here in recent weeks. Probably the top name of the newer commitments is Garrett Wilson, the wide receiver from Lake Travis High School, Austin. We've talked quite a bit about Matthew Baldwin, the quarterback from Lake Travis High School. He's a 2018 graduate. Well, now in 2019, his top wide receiver, Garrett Wilson, 6'1", 195 pounds. He's ranked as the number 30 prospect in the country, the number 5 wide receiver, and the number 4 prospect overall in the state of Texas. And he picked the Buckeyes over the University of Texas as well. So he would be a tremendous piece of that 2019 class. They also added an athlete prospect, Ronnie Hickman, out of New Jersey. He's ranked 119th nationally, 6'1", 200 pounds. It's up in the air where he could fit in. Some people say defense, some people say wide receiver. So I guess we'll have to wait and see on that. And another guy here locally who they got was Cade Stover from Lexington, Ohio. Lexington is located near Mansfield, Ohio, about halfway between Columbus and Cleveland, about an hour and a half from campus. And Cade Stover, he's an outstanding sport athlete, helped his high school basketball team reach the state Final Four this past year. Good-sized kid, 6'4", 230, kind of has that prototype linebacker size that you're looking for. And he is the number 8 outside linebacker prospect in the country, number 131 overall in the 24/7 Sports Composite. He took a visit to Oklahoma, had visited Ohio State, and then verbal to Ohio State. And Cade Stover, he'd be another big part of this class as well. I think that there are a lot of tremendous prospects that the Buckeyes are entertaining on a weekly basis, and obviously when you get into June, you'll have the summer camp circuit, and obviously then they'll have their big Friday Night Lights camp in July, where they have a lot of the top prospects from all over the country come in right before the start of preseason camp to show what they could do. So I think it's going to be another very good class. The class they signed this past year was ranked number 1 all the way up until signing day. Then some things kind of fell, and I believe Georgia may have ended up with the #1 class, but Ohio State was right there, and Ohio State has been a top 5 fixture, and I don't see any reason to believe why that will not be the case again this year.
All right, Steve. I mentioned this in the past. Next time I bring you on, I'll get you prepared, and I'll send you these questions. So I'm looking for best wins since you've been following Ohio State football. I'm looking for the worst losses, and these don't necessarily need to be championship games or what's going to be the metric for the best win, but like what do you still take some pride in? What still brings a smile to your face? Or the worst losses, what still is a bit gut wrenching, still leaves a sour taste? Favorite player, best player, all time and currently, and we'll talk it up here during what we could consider kind of the dead months, except for the recruiting between the end of the spring practice and the beginning of media days and fall practice.
I have thoughts on all of that, and obviously with the passing recently of Earl Bruce, who was the coach when I was a student in the late 80s, the first 2 years I was on campus, he was the coach. A lot of thought about those great wins and tough losses, and I can tell you just in a nutshell that 2 of the tough losses have been to Michigan State in 1998 when Ohio State was undefeated and ranked #1, and then of course in 2015 when Ohio State was undefeated. I think they were ranked 1, 2, or 3 somewhere in that range that period. But it was that team that year. Most of the guts of that national championship team from 2014 were back, and both those losses cost the Buckeyes a chance at the national championship in both those seasons, 98 and 2015. I think you could say, without going too far out on a limb, that those were 2 of the most talented teams Ohio State has ever put on the field. They just didn't win the national championship, and Michigan State was to blame for it. But, I don't know. There's so many great games. This will be my 23rd or 24th year full-time doing this, and probably see myself doing it like Urban Meyer for another 15 years. I'm just kidding about that. Maybe another 10 or 15 years, who knows? But I know OSU fans are hoping that Urban is still producing results at this level all the way into his 60s and 70s.
Yeah, Steve, as you mentioned, Sparty, they've been a thorn in the side a number of times, and many of those teams weren't that good. And now the one that you mentioned recently in 2015 obviously was good enough to win the Big Ten and go to the playoff. But you could just go back a couple of years, and even though Ohio State fans know that the defense wasn't quite what it needed to be in 2013, they had a touchdown lead in the second half of the Big Ten championship game with an undefeated team against Michigan State. They couldn't hang on to that lead, or they go play Florida State for the BCS championship that year. And if you go way, way back to sometime in the 72 or 73 range, they lost a tough one to Michigan State that cost them a possible national championship as well.
Yeah, there's been several of them over the years that have just been tougher to tackle than others. I think the good news from Ohio State's standpoint is haven't had many of those type losses to the University of Michigan in recent years. Certainly they've won 15 of the last 17 matchups with Michigan, and it kind of gives rise to the speculation is Wisconsin, who they don't play on an annual basis anymore, but Wisconsin or Michigan State or Penn State, perhaps their biggest rival right now. And I think the Penn State series the last few years has just been nothing short of phenomenal. You had the double overtime game in 2014. You had Penn State knocking off the undefeated Ohio State team in 2016, and then obviously the Buckeyes coming back and storming back from I think it was a 19-point deficit to defeat Penn State in 2017. So now with the Buckeyes having to go over to Happy Valley this year, it's going to be another tough one over there this time around.
Always enjoy the conversation with Steve Hellwagon. You can join him and his work on Bucknuts. And he is the senior Big Ten writer for 247 Sports. Steve, we appreciate you jumping on board. We always love the discussion and could take it on forever, especially when we go back into the archives. So maybe we'll talk a little bit more Earl Bruce, and some of these questions can be answered concerning, best wins and worst losses. We can make that a staple during the off season.
We can do that whenever you are ready to go for it. We'll do it.
All right, Steve, have a good night.
You too.